wait one sec. Okay.
Okay, good evening. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at CUNY in New York. I'm actually speaking to you from my home in Washington, D.C. due to the pandemic. Alas, all of our events these days are virtual. As you all know, the Leon Levy Center for Biography has been around for 13 years, and its existence is entirely due to Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation. But she does extraordinary work in supporting the art and craft of biography. That is our mission. And at the core of this is these events that used to be public events and now are virtual, at least for the time being. But also we give out 5 major fellowships every year, quite substantial fellowships to encourage working biographers to be able to do their hard work. Our next event after this one, this is our first event of the autumn. Our next event will be with Rick Perlstein to talk about Reaganland, the 4th volume of his enormous semi-biographical historical work on the rise of the conservative movement in America. And that event will be on September 15th at 6 p.m. as the same time as we are meeting tonight. This evening, we are here to discuss Professor Eddie Glaude Jr.'s wonderful book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Eddie is a university professor at Princeton and the author of Democracy on Black and 4 other books. And, you know, Eddie Glaude these days defines what it means to be a public intellectual. You see him often. I see him on Morning Joe, on MSNBC and elsewhere. And he's always making incisive comments on politics, but always informed by his knowledge, his deep knowledge of our history. He's going to be interviewed in a conversation by Nicholas Boggs, who is a professor at New York University. And he recently co-edited a new edition of James Baldwin's book, Little Man, A Story of Childhood. Nick, currently one of our 5 brand new fellows at the Leon Levy Center. And he's working on a very intimate biography of James Baldwin. So he is the obvious guy to conduct this interview. And we're waiting with bated breath for his own biography to appear in the future sometime. You know, biography always takes a long time because it's very hard work. Anyway, on that note, I want to turn it over to Nick, who will conduct a conversation with Eddie, for about 40 minutes, and they'll go back and forth, and then we'll open it up to questions. You will see, you can write your questions in the chat box, and Eddie will pick out some of the more interesting ones, we hope, or all of them if we have time. And we'll go for about an hour until about 7 o'clock. Please do join us again on September 15th for our conversation with Rick Perlstein. So on that note, Nick, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you so much to Kai Bird, to the Leon Levy Center, also to Tad Zilkowski, and my fellow fellows this most unusual year. But a special thank you to Eddie Glaude for all your commentary, and especially for this truly important book. It's part biography, part public scholarship, part personal essay, and part a much needed political critique of our times, all of it addressing how and why James Baldwin matters so much today. I am already learning from it, I am already teaching it, and I'm delighted to speak with you tonight.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. We get to just nerd out on Jimmy, right? This is just great.
That's right. So I know this book actually began as what you called an intellectual biography. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about the book's journey from that to the amazing thing that it became?
You know, initially my idea was to kind of finally grapple with the intellectual resources that shape Baldwin's aesthetic imagination. Baldwin has been so central to my own philosophical work. In A Shade of Blue, a book that I wrote about African American, about race and American pragmatism, Baldwin's work, there's a quote, there's an epigraph from Jimmy for every chapter except for the last one. And the last one is Toni Morrison, which is who, of course, is indebted to Jimmy. And so there's a sense in which the way in which I've been grappling with John Dewey, the way in which I've been grappling with William James, Baldwin has always been a resource. And so I thought, let me take some time and write, a biography of Baldwin, like the biographies of Emerson or the biography of Westbrook's biography of Dewey, where you weave his life in, alongside of an extensive philosophical engagement with his essays. But I kept running into a problem with not only the archive, the Schomburg was amazing,
right.
But there's so much more that's there. And so I kept running into a problem. I didn't know if I could say anything new. And David Lemming tried to do something like this with his biography. Right. And so I was at a crossroads. I signed the contract in 2 years, a year and a half in, and I had not put a sentence to page. And I happened to be in Heidelberg, and I write about this, and I see 4 police officers, white police officers, with their knees in the back of a black man who's screaming at the top of his lungs. And I leave and go back to my flat, and I just started writing furiously. And much of the introduction to the book was actually written that moment. And I realized at that moment that I had the hook, that it wasn't going to be, that the book wasn't simply a biography, that I had to think with Jimmy about our current moment. But in order to do so, I had to deal with his pain, his wound, his insight, the relationship between his insight and his wound, and his pain and his trauma. And Nicholas, in some ways, that meant that I had to deal with the late Jimmy, mm-hmm. Right? The Baldwin that most people don't run to, right? And so suddenly the book just bloomed in front of me, and then I wrote furiously for the next year.
That is a great story that you open with in Heidelberg, and actually it reminded me of a quote from Baldwin that I wanted to read to you about why he left, at least for a little while, America in 1948. This is from an interview in the New York Times. An article appeared in 1977. He writes, "I left America because I had to. It was a personal decision. I wanted to write, and it was the 1940s, and it was no big picnic for blacks. I grew up on the streets of Harlem, and I remember President Roosevelt, the liberal, having a lot of trouble with an anti-lynching bill he wanted to get through to Congress. Never mind the vote, never mind the restaurants, never mind schools, never mind a fair employment policy. I had to leave. I needed to be in a place where I could breathe and not feel someone's hand on my throat." 1977, which of course is sort of in the heart of your book, in a way, that later period. He also he talked then about how he had to leave in order to write Giovanni's Room. Sorry, Go Tell on the Mountain. And it was there I began to struggle with words. It's uncanny and disturbing, isn't it, that he was writing this way at that time, and then the experience he witnessed. Can you talk a little bit about the book and how Baldwin felt like he had to leave America, but in some ways America was inescapable?
Yeah, and so what's so wonderful about the quotation that you've pulled is 1977, and it's an echo of a story that he's told repeatedly.
Right.
But what's interesting in the 1977 quotation is that his stepfather is not at the heart of it. right? And so when we think about the kind of earlier versions of the account of leaving, right, the younger Baldwin is kind of talking about grappling with the overbearing presence of his father, who has succumbed to the ravages of white supremacy in this country, that hatred has taken root in his spirit, and that hatred evidences itself in the way in which he treats his children, in the way in which he treats his wife, and the like. And so when we read Notes of a Native Son, right, kind of the eve upon which he leaves the country, right, there is this story of the parallel of the burial of his father, the riot in Harlem, the birth of his youngest sister, right? All of this is about this extraordinarily painful labor to give birth to the artist, because he had to leave Harlem. And we must be clear, Baldwin is not from Sugar Hill.
Mhm.
He's growing up in the ghetto, right? He's grappling with hunger. He's resource deprived, to put it in a generous way.
Right.
That he has to, when he goes to Europe, he literally wills himself into being a writer. He engages in this extraordinary act of self-creation. And he had to do so without the daily assaults and cuts and pressure, the assaults and cuts of white supremacy, the pressure of having to be the eldest,
Right.
in a family that was struggling to eat, right? And, so in 77, when you read the quote, you don't hear the story about he's in, right down the street here in Princeton, and he's in the restaurant, the diner, and the white woman refuses to serve him, and he hurls the glass at her head, and then he has to run for his life, right? Because that story is important, because he's trying to tell the story in that moment of how the hatred that was in his father was taking root in him, and it was beginning to strangle him. The hand around his throat isn't just simply white supremacy, right? It is white supremacy and its effects. It is the torturous response that we have, that we always have to, in some ways, respond to it. So I love that quotation, because it shows us, right, what it means to track Baldwin over time, right? That there's a continuity of theme that shifts given the shifting material conditions, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And speaking of shifting, and I want to come back to some very specific questions about your book and various chapters, but one of the aspects that I really admire about this book is its refusal to kind of buy into this notion of Baldwin's decline as an artist, as a writer, and his later work. In many ways, this is a biography of No Name in the Street, his 1972 essay. That excerpt in the New Yorker was fantastic. Can you talk a little bit, for those viewers who are not familiar with this kind of narrative, where he falls out of favor with critics, and a more recent effort, and your book is included in it, to kind of reconsider, reclaim, and sort of recalibrate sort of the last decade, 2 decades of his work?
In a lot of ways, I think, in the academy, that declension narrative no longer obtains, right? So when we look at the James Baldwin's review, with Dwight McBride and others, and there's been much more attention given to the later novels and to the later nonfiction. Richard Blent's work in New York at the level of public culture and public memory. But I think that declension story took hold because I would really want to locate it with Joseph Campbell's biography, right, where he makes the argument that in 1963, I think he uses this kind of language, Baldwin's voice broke, where he says in effect that Baldwin put aside the question of being an artist and became more interested in the politics and the propaganda of the moment. His anger and his rage took over. He locates that around 63. perhaps in response to the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. And of course, we get Blues for Mr. Charlie, and then what happens post that moment. Others would want to locate it more so with the assassination of Dr. King in '68. But it's hard to kind of chart this. What I want to do, what I thought was important, is to say that oftentimes that declension narrative is rooted in a judgment of Jimmy's politics,
right,
more so than a judgment of his aesthetics. And oftentimes that is a kind of reflection of a refusal to pay attention to what he's doing at the level of form.
right.
No Name in the Street for me is an gorgeous book at the level of form. Even his mistakes make sense when you think about it as a book that's trying to at the level of writing, mirror trauma and how to account for it. So the way in which he's constantly folding back on himself. And remember, No Name in the Street it's published in '72. He calls it this mighty motherfucker. Excuse my language, right? But it is the first book that he writes after King's assassination in '68. Of course, you get the rap on race with Margaret Mead, the conversation with Nikki Giovanni, and a couple of fugitive journalistic pieces. But No Name in the Street is the answer to the breakdown.
Right. It's
the answer to the collapse. So it is the gateway to the later work. So in order to understand, and in some, and I kind of, when I teach Jimmy for my undergraduates, Baldwin's Fire Next Time is the prophecy. No Name in the Street is the reckoning. And you can't get to that. You can't tell that story if it's a narrative of declension.
That's right.
Right.
What's fascinating is the use of the I in both of those essays, and the we and the you, and how that switches. I want to come back to that question because that's also something that you do really wonderfully in your book, I noticed. And I want to ask you a question about that in the context. It's a little bit of a plug for the Levy Center. Later this month, Judith Thurman will be giving the keynote for the Levy Center, their annual lecture. And I thought of a quote from her, actually, as I read your book and thought about this question of the use of the I. She's writing about, actually, biography and translation. She's talking about poetry, but I think it applies here. I'm curious to see what you think. She writes, biography and translation are related enterprises. And here she says, the transcription school sticks timidly to the shore of fact, accounting for every petty quarrel, doctor's appointment, cup of coffee, thank you note, orgasm, and pair of gloves. Such biographies may be useful to the scholar, but they cheat a lay reader of something more vibrant and sensuous. The story, which only comes through an imaginative connection. When one translates the story of another life, an epic with ellipses, lost passages, obscure references, is always into one's own sentences. And if the essential question of biography is who are you, the only way to hold a steady course toward the answer is to keep asking at frequent intervals, who am I? And I think your book is just this. You are constantly asking, who am I? But also, who are we as individuals, as a country, as members of a fractured global community? I also think you do a great job of sort of translating Baldwin, right, into today's context. Can you talk a little bit about the use of I in your work, and then maybe we'll switch over back to it specifically in Baldwin's?
That's such a great question, Nick. And I haven't been, you do these sorts of talks, and you fall back on the rote things that you say over and over. I'm being redundant here. You give the rote responses. So this is really helpful. I wanted to write in Heidelberg at the moment of the moment of revelation was that I had to grapple with my despair, my disillusionment, right? So here I am in Heidelberg, a moment of respite. I'm a country boy from Mississippi. I'm at the university where Hegel taught, and I'm walking up Philosopher's Way. I'm in this space that, as a child, was not available to me because I didn't know it existed. And here I am, and the first thing I encounter when I leave my apartment is the very thing I had just left when I left the United States. And so I had to ask myself, how am I going to pick up the pieces? How am I going to continue to fight? White folk have done it again. They've done it again. My son will have to go through this. I went through this. My dad went through this. His father went through this. They've done it again. And I was so naive that I didn't think they would ever, vote someone who was so obviously unqualified to be the president of the United States. I should have known better. I'm a lifelong reader of Baldwin. And so the I is at the heart of the motivation of the hook. Because Baldwin, I wanted to walk with Jimmy because he felt despair too. Because they did it to him. They did it in his time. And so how did he pick up the pieces? How can the way he picked up the pieces help me pick up mine? And so the heart of the book is really, and I should say it in this way as opposed to the heart of the book. I should say it. Jimmy not only is grappling with his own despair and disappointment and trauma and wound, but he's looking in the eyes of these babies, these students who were in the part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were freedom riders, who risked everything. And he told them that he would never betray them. And he saw the rage in their eyes. He understood why they were crying for Black power. And he had to give an account, no matter the cost. And so here I am in my own moment. We've elected Donald Trump, and all of those young people who risked everything with Black Lives Matter stood down tanks, stood down, police in their military garb. What was I to say to them and to me? So the I is triage in some ways, and I found some help in the ruins, as it were.
Yeah. And that is part of what's so interesting, is going from the we of the Fire Next Time, right? And he was talking about the relatively conscious whites, the relatively conscious Blacks, the possibility interracial coalition in the 60s, right? And then come No Name in the Street, there's a shift. It's a shift away into an attention to the Black community, to the Black family, to Black nationalism. I don't have to tell you this, but can you talk a little bit about the challenges for Baldwin and for yourself, I think, in a book like yours that's reaching so many people, reaching Americans and beyond Americans, that tension? Because I remember you say, I'm going to read a good passage here from your introduction. The American idea is in trouble. It should be. We have told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vices. But today we confront the ugliness of who we are. Our darker angels reign. And you go to Trump and the larger forces that make him possible. But you also shift out to your own I, then also a we for Black Americans. Can you talk about sort of the necessity, the strategic use of these different pronouns in this book, but also if Baldwin was, of course, a master at it?
Oh my God, I love that you're drawing our attention to that. So I'll preface it with a story. I went to interview Michael Thelwell, and he's a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, emeritus, and he's a very cantankerous reader.
Okay.
So I gave him the first 4 chapters of Begin Again, and when I drove up to Amherst to meet him, the first thing he says is, "I thought you were a smart guy. This is bullshit. This makes no sense to me." And then we got to talking, and I started trying to explain to him what I was trying to do. And then he gave me this language. He says, Baldwin's we shifted after the assassination of King. And you need to account for that shift in his we. And so, and that's kind of in alignment with what you're saying about, after the betrayal of the movement, Baldwin begins to pay attention to Black English. He begins to say, look, our task is not to try to save white folk. Our task is to just simply build the New Jerusalem, and that sort of thing. So I try to be true to that shift because I think Thelwell was right. Mm-hmm. But I'm still struck, and I remain struck by Baldwin's "We and Many Thousands Gone." Mm-hmm. Right, Notes of a Native Son, right? That collection, and Baldwin's "We" shifts from when he occupies the space of speaking as white America, right, the space of speaking for Black America, and this aspirational we, the we that is to emerge from this encounter, from this collision that is history and that is our past. What is it? What is the we that will emerge out of the confrontation with who we are and what we've done? So my we is always operating at least 3 different registers. Sometimes I'm using we to talk about white America. Sometimes I'm using, and then at that point I'm engaging in a kind of ventriloquist kind of move of, kind of trying to occupy that space, to inhabit it in order to make a point. Other times the we is an insular we. It's the we to whom I am indebted, my sense of obligation. But it's always underneath those two is the aspirational we. The aspirational we that Baldwin never gave up on. Right. So even at the end of Fire Next Time, we like lovers. Must even that sentence, which you might think is located at that moment, that we will be carried forward. As even when he's speaking at the National Press Club, you hear that we, right? You even hear that we in the welcome table, right? And so part of our task in order to break through this declension narrative is, I think, to pull the continuity of theme, to pull that thread from beginning to end and then chart how he riffs on it. This is why I begin the book with that Coltrane analogy, right? It sounds the same, but it's so damn dissonant. You don't hear, what is he playing? And then but there's something that sounds familiar here. That's a long rambling way of answering your question, Nicholas. Sorry.
And generous. And I think one of the important points is that your book makes, that he made, is that within this we, it is the job of white Americans, right, to deal with their racism. It's not this isn't a Black American problem, this is a white American problem. And in your first chapter, I'd never heard of it put quite this way. Baldwin's writing about whiteness and innocence. You talk about it as the lie. I thought that was a great way and a very teachable way of describing the problematic that Baldwin, really took to white readers throughout his career. Could you talk a little bit about the lie?
The lie, and he makes it explicit. He uses that word in several places. In 1964, in the essay "The White Problem," he says, the country was predicated on a fatal flaw, right? That these people who thought themselves Christian, right, had to figure out what they were up to as they snatched these people from Africa and made them slaves. And in order not to, they had to say, in effect, that they weren't human beings, right? That they weren't men and women, because if they were, then they had a problem. So if they weren't human beings, then there was no crime that had been committed. And then there's that line that I fixated on. Baldwin says, right, that lie is the basis of our present problem. Right. Or if you read the essay that he wrote for Nothing Personal with Richard Avenden, there is again the lie at the heart of it, and how the lie distorts and disfigures our self-conception. So the lie at its root is this story that America's told itself, that it is the shining city on the hill, that is an example of democracy already achieved, that America is the Redeemer nation. And so in order to hold that view of America, that exceptional view of America in one's hands, it had to deny and lie about what it was actually doing to particular people. So it had to lie about our capacities, our passions, right? Our humanity. And it built an entire world, a civilization around those lies. And Baldwin is insisting from the very beginning, as this young man, that we have to confront that honestly. Because, this is why, Henry James is so important to him, right? Because the lie blocks us from seeing the human being right in front of us. And the lie blocks us from seeing who we are, right? What we have failed to do in our choices and the like. So, as I've been teaching Du Bois this semester, I've been noticing the lie everywhere. He even uses the phrase. It's actually quite fascinating.
And now the lie, of course, is really everywhere in our culture. So before I turn to this question of beginning again and how one begins again, and you have a very impassioned conclusion to the book that I want to address, I do want to nerd out as a biographer and go back to this Fern Ekman. You tell this story about, for the biographers out there, those interested in biography, there is a rich history of Baldwin biography. David Leeming's essential book, really service to humanity. There's also wonderful scholarship out there. But Fern Ekman is an interesting figure. Do you want to say a little bit about her and sort of, your transcript?
Yeah. So Fern Ekman is, she has a page in the basement of the New York Post and makes her way up the ladder.
The 50s, right? I mean, back in
the 40s.
40s, right?
So she's stunning, and I think there very well may be portions of the transcript coming out in the New Yorker soon. I don't know if I should have said that. Oops, but we'll see. So when you read, The Furious Passage, which is the first biography written about Jimmy, I think it's published in '66, right. And Baldwin hated it. And the family hated it because she tries to psychoanalyze him. I mean, whenever she does that, it just gets really bad. But the book is a treasure trove of quotations. I mean, it's just everywhere. You're just gonna go, oh my God! And so, as a historian of sorts, I wanted to find out where these tapes were. Where were the reels? Are they weren't at the Schomburg? Where are they? Are they at the Smithsonian? And so I started hunting, and I couldn't find them. And my writing partner is Imani Perry. And Imani Perry had written this gorgeous biography of Lorraine Hansberry, and so we are always exchanging stuff. And I was like, I wish I could get a hold of Fern Margie Ekman, but of these interviews. And she said, well, why don't you call her? I said, she has to be about 100 freaking years old. What are you talking about? She's not alive. And so she goes back upstairs to her office, and I'm downstairs in my office, and suddenly I get an email with 3 numbers, just 3 numbers in New York. And I dial the first number, bing, and it's the healthcare worker from Fern Margie Ekman.
Amazing.
And doesn't quite speak English, and so I'm trying to tell them, and she said, call back. And then I end up talking with her niece, and I go to the Upper West Side and meet her niece, and then, well, there are no tapes. They're all lost. I've been looking for them. And then she said, but they're transcriptions. And I'm going, oh, okay, transcriptions. Okay, this is great. I'm thinking I'm going to get about 10 pages, 20 pages, and she gives me about 100 plus pages of transcriptions, and I'm just like, oh my God, kismet. And it's there in the witness chapter in particular, that I get this definition of witness. And we were reading it over the phone together, and it was just mind-blowing, man. It's one of those.
Imani Perry? Or you?
No, Fern's niece.
Fern's niece. Well, thank you to her for keeping those transcripts alive, and very much look forward to seeing them in the New Yorker or anywhere, really. And speaking of Imani Perry, as we move towards beginning again, I also just want to sort of remark upon, and maybe you would, sort of just the groundswell of important biographies of Black figures that we've seen in the last few years. Imani Perry's book on Lorraine Hansberry, Carrie Greenidge on William Trotter, Alain Locke by Stewart. Is the telling of these lives, the amplifying of these voices, is that part of how we can begin again? I mean, in combination, of course, white America has a long overdue reckoning, but I'm interested in strategies for beginning again.
I think the biography is so important for a number of different reasons, but I think biographies are exemplar. They are part of the education of character. Build them. Right. So what does it mean to model one's life? I mean, I'm going to sound a bit too abstract here, but it's like reading, Emerson's Representative Men. Mm-hmm. What is it? We're not writing hagiography, but what does it mean to kind of think of a life that's important enough to dwell in, right? To dwell in those experiences. In our moment, a moment of such precarity and death, such darkness, it makes sense that we're reaching for lives of substance and significance, to model what it means to be courageous and what it means to be committed and thoughtful, what it means to exhibit integrity in these moments, what it means to be committed to the kind of Socratic dictum of self-examination. So for me, I think not so much about beginning again, Nicholas, but I think it's more about, lives that model for us a kind of seriousness, or let me put it this way, a sound of the genuine, in a moment that has been overrun, by surface living. So, and then on alongside that is, what does it mean to reach for the lives of these ancestors as memoir is taking off? Because memoir is standing in for broader history, as it were. Right? So we got these biographies standing alongside, memoir, and for such a long for the last few years, it seems as if memoir has stood in for rich, thick history. Right? I can get a sense of the complexity of Black life by just simply paying attention to the life of this one person, and that's dangerous, it seems to me. But
there's poetry too, of course. It's been an incredible era for African American poetry. So in terms of beginning again, then I want to read two quotes. The quote that you quote from Baldwin, which is, I believe, from just above my head: "Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again." Yeah. And then you quote Maya Angelou. It's similar to Baldwin's quote about you can't change something until you face it. I'm paraphrasing, but Angelou says, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." When we do feel like we are living it again, from you locate Civil War and Reconstruction as a key period, then Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century, and now with the mass incarcerations, the shootings, which are murders of Black Americans, and then these renewed protests. What is, we're living it again. So how do we begin again?
Tell the truth. Jimmy, in his last interview with Quincy Troop, said sometimes you feel like a broken motor saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. You can only go to Texas so many times, as he put it. But that passage from just above my head is this haunting passage, right? Because he's talking about what happened in the face of the betrayal. That when the dream was shattered, people scattered. Folk ended up in jail. Folk were killed. Folk left. But he says, even in spite of that, you don't give up. You don't abdicate one's responsibility, right? You still have to push this boulder up the hill, even if it's Sisyphean, right? And what Baldwin reveals in that moment is that the end is not the actual, the objective, the beautiful struggle. I mean, it's existentialist in certain ways, right? Or as Talib Kweli would call it, the beautiful struggle is what matters, right? So how do we begin again? We tell the truth. We call out the lies. We risk everything right now, right here. We don't allow the country to pat itself on the back. And I think that's the key, and Jimmy, he would insist that, human beings are miracles and disasters all at once. And that in the face of the disastrous choices that we've made, if we show up, there's a chance for miracles. And if that's true, then we got to keep doing that hard work of inventing hope.
Hope. Like another
inventing it,
Yeah, that's right. Well, if we had more time, I would have a lot more questions for you about his fiction, in terms of all these questions, since the quote was from just above my head, and more of these keywords that you go into. But I want to make sure we have time. We have
Sure.
a lot of viewers here tonight, and I want to make sure that we have time for some questions.
Sure.
So if you'll give me just one moment, I'm going to check this out. Oh, actually, I'm going to ask you an opening question that relates to them.
Okay.
Relates to your book. How do you feel, or what is your opinion about this desire to kind of know what Baldwin would have thought about our era? And I'm thinking about that amazing quote he had in response to Kennedy saying, someday there'll be a black president. And he said, what I'm concerned about is what kind of country there'll be a black president of, which of course was precisely the country that could then go and elect Donald Trump. So before I take these questions, how do you feel? I mean, you're being asked to do this a lot in one.
All the time.
What are some of the possibilities of that, and maybe the perils of trying to imagine how he would have reacted to our moment?
So I resist it over and over again. There are over 7,000 pages of writing.
Right.
So if we want to think about, if we want to know what Jimmy thought about this moment, just read him. There's a lot there, and a lot of it speaks to our moment. One of the things that I try to do in this book, and I'll try to be succinct here, is that it is not a book about Baldwin. It is a book with me writing with Baldwin. So it's part biography, part literary criticism, part social criticism. And so one of the things that I had to struggle with is how to keep Baldwin from running over me, right? I mean, just crushing me like a beer can in the street, right? How do you keep him from doing that? Not only in terms of the ideas, but also the sentences on the page. How could I keep my voice and not fall into a kind of imitative mode? So whenever I confront that question, Nicholas, I tell them what I think.
Okay. Yeah.
and not try to exhibit the kind of hubris to say, well, this is what Baldwin would say. I find that to be silly, because go read him. There's a lot there.
There is a lot, and it certainly was prescient. Okay, so I'm not going to ask one of those questions, although I'll come back to those. But I actually recently saw in the Schomburg a letter from James Baldwin to Toni Morrison when she was at Random House in '75. And one thing she says is, on her time there, I intend to write a minority report for Black women in my every day here at Random House. So I bring that up just because the next question is about Toni Morrison. Let me make sure I get this right. While Baldwin's writings became progressively more political in the late 60s and 70s, his contemporaries changed from writers like Richard Wright to people like Toni Morrison. How do you reconcile the increased politicization of Baldwin's work with increased correspondence with more literary figures? Is it significant that these more literary figures were female?
Well, first of all, I don't think they're more literary.
Right.
So I would want to push back on that. And, you know, the Morrison papers are at Princeton, and I happened to sit down in them, and the letters between her and Jimmy are just amazing. Just to read. Actually, I wanted a poem that he wrote. I wanted to include a poem that he wrote to Tony as the kind of epigraph to the entire book. And then I was going to end with the poem as well, but we had some problems with copyright and the like. Morrison says, you know, when we read her eulogy of Jimmy, she's very clear where she found her feet.
Right.
She knows what his sentences made possible, the language that she found, right? The kernel, the gem, right? The initial beginnings was in those long sentences with those Jamesian commas and you know, the King Jamesian, not only Henry James, but the King Jamesian versions of Baldwin's, you know, rich description. I think the 1980s represent a really interesting moment. That is to say, we have talk of the Black underclass, the ascension of a Black middle class, and Baldwin was still sounding the notes of freedom. As folk were beginning to take the bribe, Jimmy was still bearing witness. So his voice is out of key during a moment in which mass consumerism and mass consumption and material greed is beginning to overrun the period. So the age of Reagan is not just about white folks. The age of Reagan is about Black folk. Right. And this is why folk don't really want to read. I'm getting to the answer, Nicholas. I'm getting to the answer. Folk really don't want to read the evidence of things not seen, right? He's at the heart of that book is what does it mean for white supremacy to obtain and Black folk hold the reins of power? How are these Black babies dying with all in this city of Atlanta? So I don't want to say that I'm arguing against the fact that he succumbs to just simply politics, that he's doing something literary across his essays and his fiction. I think Tony understands the scope and breadth of his interventions and innovation. I argue in the book by gesture that the innovation of No Name in the Street around memory and rememory is actually informing Morrison's Beloved.
That was fascinating.
That Beloved is an echo of that move. Long-winded answer to the question is that Baldwin is part and parcel of that renaissance, and he's supporting Tony. He's supporting Alice Walker. He's lifting them up, and you know, Maya Angelou is a figure that's critical to him. So he's right squarely in that moment. Sorry, I'll get more succinct, I promise.
His relationship with women is a fascinating topic, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in future conversations. Here's one with a quote, Eddie. So Baldwin wrote that the, quote, American Negro has the great advantage of having never believed that collection of myths to which white Americans cling. So wasn't he meaning, this is the question, so wasn't he meaning here the great myth of, quote, American exceptionalism? But we still seem stuck on this essential myth. We still believe that we Americans are special. Why?
So that's a wonderful quote from Fire Next Time. I teach it all the time alongside of Sack Van Berkovich's The American Jeremiad, right? And how this is an indication that Baldwin's The Fire Next Time isn't a Jeremiad, precisely because of that passage. Why is it still obtained? I want to make, and I suggest this in the book, that it's because white America, and I'm talking in the generality here, can't conceive of itself apart from it. I actually make the claim, I write it in the book, that the idea of white America is irredeemable. But it doesn't mean that we are. There's that ambiguous we again, right? It doesn't mean that we are. And part of what I was trying to suggest here, and this is kind of thinking, I was thinking through riffing on Emerson in this moment in the book, that the idea of America as exceptional is so bound up with our self-conception that when we challenge it, we think we've taken away the cornerstone of who we take ourselves to be. We can't imagine ourselves as American unless we are exceptional, right? You think about Trump, to even acknowledge racism, right? To even engage in racial bias training is to them to engage in un-American activities. That's a quote from
exceptional in all the wrong ways.
In all the wrong ways. And I think it has something to do why. So the short answer to the question is, why can't we get beyond it? Is because our self-conception, our identity as individuals and a nation seem to be bound up with it. Right. This is why re-narrating who we take ourselves to be, telling a different story, is so important. That's like what Edward Said says in Beginnings. The problem of beginnings is the beginning of the problem. Where we start.
Great. So here's another one. Could you say something about Baldwin's notion of love and how much of it is indebted to a Christian conception of love as forgiveness? Love plays a significant role in his fiction that seems quite different from this idea of Christian love.
Yeah, Baldwin's conception of love is not just simply agape. It's philia, it's eros, right? That moment that we all reach for in finite time, right? Americans, those of us who are committed to we must, like lovers, achieve our like lovers. What does that phrase mean? What is he referencing there? And that is that moment of intense vulnerability. What does it mean to stand in front of one's lover without any clothes, where you can see all the blemishes, all the faults and foibles, to surrender oneself in the arms of another, where salvation is found not in, restriction or taboo, but found in that moment of union, experienced in the recognition of suffering and what that suffering enables us to see in the heart of the other and in oneself, right? As Baldwin would say over and over again, the suffering is the bridge, right? As late as 1980, 81, Baldwin, in an interview in Turkey, is talking about love. And love is not some abstraction, right? I mean, Giovanni's Room there's a reason why that's the second book. Right? And it's not.
Yeah, go tell them.
Yeah, it's go tell them. And right, but we read Giovanni's Room, and it's an extraordinarily courageous book. But Baldwin it's a story of love.
Oh yeah.
Right? Same-sex love, but you love who you love. Right? Remember what he says in From Another Place, right? So there's a sense in which Baldwin's conception of love is transformative. It is a source of how to invent hope every day.
Absolutely. Oh man. Okay, so here's, I think, one more question that we have time for.
Sure.
My undergraduate students love James Baldwin, and maybe this has something to do with Giovanni's Room, actually. My undergraduate students love James Baldwin and find his work to be a revelation to them, but most of them say they never heard of him in secondary school. Can you speak about why James Baldwin has been kept from young people? Is it related to the fact that he wasn't allowed to speak at the March on Washington? They asked you to speak to Baldwin. This is a little different, but as a radically critical voice.
Yeah, I think, Jimmy had to be rediscovered. There's a reason why he didn't win the Nobel. There's a reason why, America didn't accept him like France did. It has something to do with his political voice. The choices he made. He knew the consequences. That narrative of declension has everything to do with the nation's refusal to deal with Black power. Right. So Baldwin doesn't dismiss it, and because he doesn't dismiss it, he gets caught up in the national dismissal of the moment. Right. Even during John Lewis's funeral, Bill Clinton has to dismiss it. We lost our way for a period when we followed Stokely, right? So there's a sense in which he had to be found. I want to insist that we have to engage him in the entirety of who he is. The rage lights the kiln, as I write. You can't not just reach for Jimmy and love. No, 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 no. You got to deal with the fire. You got to deal with the reckoning. You got to deal with the fullness of who he is, and he's this, queer, gay, black man, right, who dared to tell the truth no matter what the cost. And so Baldwin, to this day, unsettles. This misfitted gay black man, to this day, when you encounter him, bring your big boy and big girl pants, because he's going to ask something of you that will fundamentally shake you to your core, because he's the most insightful critic we've ever produced when it comes to race and democracy in the country's history of letters.
That is right. That actually leads to what is not a question, but one of our viewers' observations, which is that 2024 is his centennial. And they ask, or they suggest, that there's got to be a way to celebrate him in that year. And they ask us to do that, put that together. But I want to say, we'll work on that. But I want to end by saying, what do you hope for 2024? What would be an appropriate way for this country and this world to be heading in that anniversary of his birth?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we were in the midst of a genuine truth and reconciliation, where the country was grappling with, or is grappling with, its own past as we try to write a different future? Wouldn't it be a wonderful celebration if we were grappling with telling ourselves a different story about who we are? It would be a testament. He's waiting for us. He's waiting for us. He's waiting for us to pass through this history, to see what history has made of us. But we can't get there until we engage in the reckoning, tell the truth about who we are, about what we've done, so that we can release ourselves into a new Jerusalem. So 2024, a new Jerusalem being imagined in the midst of a genuine Truth and Reconciliation Commission doing its work across the country. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
That would be wonderful, Eddie, and your book helps make it happen. So thank you again so much, and thank you to the Levy Center, and thank you for folks for tuning in. Good night.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.